Napoleon, the Emperor of France, had a goal: to conquer all of Europe, a feat that nobody's ever achieved before or since. But he came very close. At his peak, he had taken present-day Belgium and Holland, along with large chunks of present-day Italy, Croatia, and Germany, and had large influence in Switzerland, Poland, and various German states. Spain was largely under his rule too, despite continuing guerrilla warfare there, and Austria, Prussia, and Russia had been forced into becoming allies. Only Great Britain remained completely outside of his grasp. So as you can see, he wasn't far off, but in 1806 he made a decision that would later turn out to be a fatal mistake. It would result in Napoleon gathering the most diverse army Europe had seen since the Crusades, numbering 600,000 men, and he would lose almost all of them. So what happened? Where did everything go wrong? Well, from when he became emperor in 1799, his path to conquering Europe was fairly smooth, with a string of victories wherever he went, and come 1806, he only had Britain left to deal with. Although his empire was powerful, Britain had the biggest empire the world had ever seen, and also the best navy. So although only a small island a few miles away from him, taking it by force was not going to be easy. To defeat the British, Napoleon thought of another idea, and it cost him everything. In 1806, Napoleon decided to punish the British with an embargo that became known as the Continental System. In essence, this system was designed to paralyze Britain by destroying their trade with other European nations. As most of Europe was under Napoleon's control, forcing countries to not trade with Britain was easy, and it had the desired effect. However, although punishing Britain was his main aim, as you can imagine, its impact was seen across Europe, and one particular country was not happy about it. Tsar Alexander, the first of Russia, was a reluctant ally of Napoleon after being beaten into submission in 1807 after the Battle of Friedland. This battle was the result of Napoleon pushing into Prussian territory on France's eastern border. Napoleon at the time wasn't planning to invade Russia, but the Russians saw this as a threat and aimed to nip it in the bud early. This was probably a good idea. He would have certainly invaded Russia at some point. So 80,000 of Napoleon's men fought 60,000 Russians, and Napoleon's army crushed them. Napoleon's army lost around 8,000 men, whereas the Russians lost nearly 40,000. So by 1810, Napoleon had secured most of Europe, bullied Russia into being his ally, and had a successful blockade set up for British trade that was starting to damage their economy. Things were looking good for his plan for world domination. But now, a few years after Russia's defeat, Tsar Alexander wasn't happy. The continental system of blockades was starting to affect Russia's trade too, and the value of the ruble was decreasing rapidly. So to spite Napoleon, Tsar Alexander imposed a heavy tax on French luxury products and refused Napoleon's attempt to marry one of his sisters. Napoleon, who considered Russia a natural ally since it had no territorial conflicts with France, soon moved to teach Alexander a lesson. Napoleon raised a huge army, numbering 600,000 men from all over Europe, and crossed the Niemen River to face an estimated 200,000 Russian troops. He defeated them before and outnumbered them again. Napoleon was confident in his victory. Just to put these numbers into perspective, by comparison, George Washington's army during the American Revolution rarely numbered more than 15,000 men. This was two gigantic armies clashing. Battles on this scale are rare and are always pivotal moments in history. It was truly a massive confrontation. Napoleon's goal was to win a quick victory that forced Alexander to the negotiating table, but this would not go to plan. The Russians pulled back and let the Napoleon's army capture the city of Vilna on June 27th, with barely a fight. In an ominous sign of things to come, an electrical storm pouring down freezing rain, hail and sleet killed a number of troops and horses that very night. Napoleon was now in the heart of freezing cold Russia, and winter was soon approaching. To make matters worse, his soldiers were already deserting in search of food and plunder. Nonetheless, Napoleon remained confident. "I have come once and for all to finish off these barbarians of the north," he declared to his top military advisors. "The sword is now drawn. They must be pushed back into their ice, so that for the next 25 years, they no longer come to busy themselves with the affairs of civilized Europe." In his mind, this was a classic civilizer versus barbarian battle, a naive sentiment from the French emperor. In late July, the Russians similarly abandoned Vitebsk, setting fire to military stores and a bridge on their way out. Then, in mid-August, they retreated from Smolensk and torched that city. Many peasants, meanwhile, burned their crops to prevent them from falling into French hands. Napoleon was now engaged in a cat-and-mouse chase, with the Russian army constantly eluding him and leading him deeper into the heart of Russia. His soldiers weren't happy. They were catching diseases and starving now. Most of their supplies were running out with no way to sustain them. Feeding an army of nearly 1 million is no easy task, especially with the Russians destroying all of their crops as Napoleon advanced. Thousands of men died while fighting at Smolensk and elsewhere. But the Russians did not truly make a stand until the September 7th Battle of Borodino, which took place just 75 miles from Moscow. This is where the real battle begun. That day, the French and Russians pounded each other with artillery and launched a number of charges and countercharges. Roughly 3 cannon booms and 7 musket shots rang out each second. The losses on both sides were enormous, with total casualties of at least 70,000. Rather than continue with a second day of fighting, the Russians withdrew and left the road to Moscow open. A week later, on September 14th, Napoleon's army entered the ancient capital of Moscow, believing surely this would be where Tsar Alexander makes his stand. But to his dismay, he met a city engulfed in flames. Most residents had already escaped the city, leaving behind vast quantities of hard liquor but little food. French troops drank and pillaged while Napoleon waited for Alexander to sue for peace. No offer ever came. With snow flurries having already fallen, Napoleon led his army out of Moscow on October 19th, realizing that it could not survive the winter there. By this time, Napoleon was down to some 100,000 troops, the rest having died, deserted or been wounded, captured or left along the supply line. Originally, he planned a southerly retreat, but his troops were forced back to the road they took in after a replenished Russian army engaged them at Maloyaroslavets. All forage along that route had already been consumed, and when the army arrived at Smolensk, it found that stragglers had eaten the food left there. Horses were dying in droves, and the Grande Armée's flanks and rear guard faced constant attacks. The once confident Emperor of France was now in a perilous position. Fate was not on his side. That year, an unusually early winter arrived. His army was now faced with high winds, sub-zero temperatures, and lots of snow. On particularly bad nights, thousands of men and horses succumbed to exposure. There are stories of soldiers splitting open dead animals and crawling inside for warmth, or stacking dead bodies in windows for insulation. It was horrific, and Napoleon's fate was now sealed. In late November, his army narrowly escaped complete annihilation when it crossed the frigid Berezina River, but it had to leave behind thousands of wounded. From then on, it was almost every man for himself. It was no longer an army, but a horde of men trying to survive. You could say they had now become the barbarians. On December 5th, Napoleon left the army, He had heard there may be a coup and had to head back to Paris, a great excuse to leave the cold wastelands and head back to warmth. He left what remained of his army with a general and fled Russia. News of this humiliation spread like wildfire. Countries he once subdued like Austria, Prussia, and Sweden now joined Russia and Great Britain to put an end to their French oppressors for good. Although Napoleon was able to raise another massive army, this time it was short on both cavalry and experience. Napoleon won some initial victories against his enemies, but he suffered a crushing defeat in October 1813 at the Battle of Leipzig. By the following March, Paris had been captured and Napoleon was forced into exile on the island of Elba. In 1815, Napoleon made one more attempt to take power, but was overcome at the Battle of Waterloo. But these are stories for another time. Napoleon almost had Europe in the palm of his hands, but just like Charles VII before him and Hitler, who would come after him, invading Russia just never seems to work out. Attacking Russia directly led to the humiliation of all of these would-be conquerors of Europe. Hopefully, the lesson has been learned and history doesn't repeat itself again.